Hi, it's me, TM. We're going to talk a little bit about trade in Washington State, and I'm hopeful this will help you with your papers on that topic due in a few weeks. So I hope you have a chance to look at this. And of course, at the end, ask any questions for anything that doesn't make sense. All right, let's just bring up that. All right, trade and Washington State. The first thing we should understand is the logic of trade, which is to say why some people say free trade, which means trade without any restrictions, is a good idea. And the thing that backs this up is the theory of comparative advantage, which basically says make what you're good at and buy what you're not. And there's an economic logic to that. It's more productive and efficient. And for consumers, it tends to mean more and better prices and products that they can buy. However, as we are about to see, sometimes this is really true and sometimes maybe not. But here's sort of the classic example of this is a hypothetical situation. We have an economy. It has two products, broccoli and cabbage, and we have two producers, Carly and Bob. Well, clever Carly can make seven cabbages, and in the same time she could make three broccoli. Now, if we look there, we can see Bob makes three cabbages or two broccoli in the same time. So Carly is said to have an absolute advantage in both products. However, if she's smart, she should make cabbage because she gives up less to make cabbage than if she, say, made broccoli. She shouldn't do both. She should do one or the other. That puts Bob in a slightly different situation than we might expect because Bob now has a comparative advantage in broccoli because he gives up much less in terms of cabbage if he chooses broccoli. So Carly should make cabbage and Bob should make broccoli. That's the logic of the theory of comparative advantage. But there are really two kinds of comparative advantage. Now, the one that most people are thinking of, I think, is what I call a natural comparative advantage. So, production of the good benefits from natural conditions such as location, climate, soil, or availability of water. So, things that are naturally occurring, right? Things we just couldn't go out and buy. We could not alter the climate in any kind of hurry. The dirt that's there is the dirt that's there. We can fertilize, but that's only going to make up so much of a difference. So, that's a natural comparative advantage. And so if we talk about something like oranges, well, you really wouldn't want to grow oranges in Washington or Alaska or anywhere up north or even in the far south of the globe. Too cold. Orange trees will die. So places where it's warmer year round are the kinds of places it makes sense to grow oranges. You could grow them in Washington. You'd have to build enormous greenhouses and heat them throughout the winter, and you would get very expensive oranges. This was sort of actually tried in Africa a few decades ago. Some development folks from the UN said, well, if we could get more protein in these people's diets, that would be better. What about fish? So they decided they were going to produce fish in Africa, basically in the desert. And what they had bargained on was that the river they were counting on was seasonal. So half the year didn't have any water in it. So then they had to figure out how to produce water. These became the most expensive fish on earth. It made no sense to do that there. So that's a natural comparative advantage. Now, the other kind of comparative advantage is what I call investment based, which is to say, public investment in things that make it easier to produce a product. And we will see as we look at some examples from our state that both of these things can happen at the same time. Production of the good benefits from public investment in related factors such as ports, transportation networks, research and development, education and training. Those are all things that cost money. They don't just spring from seeds in the ground, right? But those things can make a product more competitive. Profitable production is aided by tax breaks. Boeing gets really big tax breaks, which is a kind of a form of subsidy. And then, of course, there's just direct subsidy. This photo, No great surprise is if an Airbus production line and the European countries where the Airbus facilities are located have dumped billions and billions of dollars into that firm, which is how it was able to succeed. So there's that kind of comparative advantage. And I always think this is worth thinking about because it undercuts the whole notion that free trade is always good. Because if somebody is subsidizing the heck out of something, it's not really competitive. It's just heavily subsidized. And that really is less efficient. Also, some people say, well, we should just sit back and enjoy the low prices. On the other hand, it costs jobs. And at the end of the day, jobs are pretty important too. So something that we have to think about. But coming back to our state, why Washington? Well, Washington is the most trade dependent state in the country. 40% of our state's economy is tied to trade, imports and exports. Nationally, trade is about a quarter of the economy, and that's been fairly steady for quite some time. But here in Washington, it's a much bigger deal. So what is it about Washington that makes it sort of trade competitive, which in fact we are? Proximity to Asia. So if you look at the sailing routes from North America to Asia, Seattle is a day closer than big ports farther down the coast, in particular Los Angeles and Long Beach. So that's a natural comparative advantage. It's just an accident of geography. Beyond that, things that come here are easily moved to rail lines, which we'll talk about in a minute. So we're well located for moving things through from Asia to other parts of the Western Hemisphere. Which brings us to proximity to transportation networks. So all those trains that you might see running through South King County are largely freight trains, and they carry goods from the ports of Seattle and Tacoma to other markets around the country. And that's an investment-based comparative advantage, right? The rail lines have been there for 100 years, and they've had to upgrade them, of course. But the point is, without good transportation connections, it wouldn't matter where we were. This wouldn't necessarily be a good place to ship things. Most of the stuff that gets shipped here goes somewhere else. So port facilities, well, as we just mentioned, we have this lovely harbor in Puget Sound, basically, right? Well, we have spent collectively a lot of money to make that into a system that accommodates shipping to and from North America. So all those cranes you see down by the waterfront, the ports of Seattle and Tacoma, which are separate local governments, but now cooperate. They used to cherry pick each other's stuff, but now they don't. They work together. Together, they are the third largest containerized shipping port on the West Coast. So it's a big deal. It produces a lot of jobs. The Port of Seattle also runs Seattle Tacoma International Airport, and of course, actually a lot of cargo moves through there too. So research and development. This is another big deal. This is an investment-based comparative advantage. If you're talking about almost any agricultural good produced in Washington, they very likely are benefiting from publicly funded research at the Washington State University School of Agriculture. It's a really world-class institution. The example we have here is the Cosmic Crisp apple. Don't know if you've ever tried one of those, but they're really, really good. Well, they were developed at WSU. Apples are kind of interesting. You buy an apple, every seed in that apple is a completely new, different kind of apple. So WSU scientists managed to create the Cosmic Crisp. It's been a hit, but point is that this helps the overall industry at public expense. Just not a bad thing because it produces jobs and tax revenues and all the things that basically what we want for our society. Similarly, education and training, like the WSU School of Agriculture, like the University of Washington School of Forestry, not only do they do research and development, they also train people to work in these industries, which generally means the people are going to be more efficient and productive and better at their jobs. that tends to help the local economy as well. And then a natural comparative advantage, which we mentioned, favorable climate and soil conditions. So a lot of eastern Washington was, in essence, solidified basalt lava. Well, it turns out that that is a really good substrate for growing things like wheat, of which we produce a lot, as we'll see. The other thing we might note is that the reason we produce so much non-citrus fruit in Washington state is the climate. Hot and sunny in summer, they have enough water for irrigation. And then what happens is in the fall, there's a cold snap. I mean, it literally turns cold overnight, and that sets the sugar in the fruit, which makes them sweeter. Well, that's a natural comparative advantage. We don't have the technology to make that happen. Good, actually. And then what I like to call public support. So going back once again to agriculture, there are a dozen fruit commissions and different crop commissions. These were created by the state government, the legislature, but they're funded by the industry, but without the legislature to sort of come and say, look, we're gonna let you do this. So the state secretary of agriculture sits on all these commissions, and their job is to push the product and find new markets and do what they can to help these industries thrive and survive. So that's a form of public support for these. So that, again, an investment-based comparative advantage. Now, what do we actually do here in Washington state? Well, I got a couple of different lists here, and we'll kind of wade through them as a way of getting a clearer picture of what we do produce that gets exported from Washington state. Commodities, crops. Apples is number one, milk and dairy, number two, potatoes, wheat, cattle, hops, which go to make beer, hay, cherries, grapes, and onions. Walla Walla Sweets, pretty good stuff. Hay is interesting. It's basically just dried grass, right? It gets fed to cattle. We have all these containers full of goods coming from Asia, coming to Seattle and Tacoma, and they were going back empty. And then way back in the 80s, somebody figured out, hey, we could put hay in there, ship that to Japan and now China, and they can feed their own cattle with this. We do have a comparative advantage in growing hay, more open land and good weather. So that became one of our top exports, which is always kind of interesting, I think. Other things that move through our ports. Now, civilian aircraft, it says civilian aircraft, including engines. We don't produce any engines in Washington state, but we do produce a lot of aircraft and a lot of aircraft parts. On the other hand, soybeans. There are no soybeans grown in Washington state. So what this is really looking at is soybeans grown in the Midwest, brought out here on rail cars, and then shipped to Asia. So it's an export that moves through Washington. It's not really from Washington. The same thing is true of grain sorghum and soybean flours, and probably a lot of that corn. We are one of the leading producers of sweet corn, which is the kind of stuff you'd eat for dinner. Most of this corn, I think, is probably feed corn, which is going to, once again, feed livestock, which often can't digest it and have to be shot full of antibiotics, but that's a different story, isn't it? Grain-fed beef is not the best thing that we do, frankly. Same thing, miscellaneous petroleum oils. We have 5 major refineries on Puget Sound, but the oil is all coming from Alaska. So which is kind of the same thing that we run into with fish, right? Fish is a big export from Washington state, but most of those fish are coming from Alaska. So while the fishing fleet is from here, and it's very important, and it's a big industry, on the other hand, the Washington fishery is a lot smaller than the Alaska fishery, so it's not really our export. It is and it isn't. Now, frozen potatoes, right? French fries. Washington is a leading producer of potatoes in the country, so A lot of those get chopped up and frozen and sent off to Asia again. So that's a big export for us. There is a company that makes ultrasonic scanning equipment, and they sell a bunch of it. And then, of course, apples once again. So it's useful, I think, to look at more than one list because you start to get a picture of what it is that we do actually do. So here we see, according to this list, fish and seafood is our top export. That varies from time to time. Wheat, that's certainly true, although some of that wheat probably comes from the Midwest as well. Apples, dairy, hay, hops. Let's see, beef, cherries, pulses are peas, and Skagit County, just north of us. 30% of the nation's fresh peas and 70% of the nation's pea seed. So that's a big business around here. One that doesn't quite show up here, one of our leading trade partners is the Netherlands. Now, the Netherlands is a place that really popularized tulips several centuries ago, but they grow a lot still. One of the things that we ship to the Netherlands is, in fact, tulip bulbs. And somebody I know ordered some tulip bulbs from the Netherlands, because that would be cool to have, they thought. And they got the package, and the box said produce of Skagit County. So a lot of trade actually happens, between countries that produce the same thing. So now, here again, just to think about the farms for a minute. 35,500 farms in Washington state, 95% of them are family owned with 300 different crops. And I like this list because it just talks about how good farmers here are at producing a number of things. Number one producer of apples, blueberries, hops, pears, spearmint oil, and sweet cherries. Number two producer, apricots, asparagus, grapes, taters, and raspberries, right? Raspberries don't just grow anywhere, and we grow a bunch of them. Number three producer of dried peas, lentils, onions, and peppermint oil. So if you think about spearmint oil and peppermint oil, if you brushed your teeth this morning, there's some chance that your toothbrush had that wonderful minty flavor. It started out as a plant on a farm near Yakima. So that is something that we do. So as you think about what you're writing about, think about the kinds of comparative advantage that your product enjoys by being made in Washington state, which is sort of to say, why are these things built here? So if we look at something like airplanes, there's no particular reason to produce airplanes in Washington state. It happened because Bill Boeing had timberlands out here, and early in the 20th century, he moved to Aberdeen to manage his family's timberlands, and in the meantime, caught the flying bug, bought an airplane, said, I think we could build a better one, and he did. So that succeeded here almost by chance. I mean, there was sort of some infrastructure that made it possible. If he'd been, had an alkali mine in the middle of the desert, it would have been much harder for him to decide to make airplanes there. But be that as it may, you could build them in a lot of places. On the other hand, these crops really are here in large part because of the natural comparative advantage of doing it here. So, I mean, there are other agriculturally productive parts of the world, but they don't produce the same kinds of things that we do. One of the things we saw on our list there was grapes, and wine grapes are good ones, are ones that can really only be grown in certain parts of the world. There's a number of them. But if you've ever had wine from a region where the soil and the climate are not particularly good for growing grapes, you'll know the difference in a hurry. Same thing with coffee. Coffee only grows in certain parts of the world. So clearly that's a natural comparative advantage. So, all right. If you have any questions of this, I really hope you will email me or something and let me know. And otherwise, good luck with your papers, and I hope to talk to you soon. Take care.